how do we even begin to understand the past? I mean, when you think about it, our world today, our values, they feel so incredibly different from how things were. It's a real challenge, isn't it?
It really is. And uh, wrestling with that challenge is basically what ethical historical inquiry is all about. That's what we're diving into today, looking at these, well, fascinating source materials.
Exactly. And these sources, they really dig into the tough questions historians grapple with, when they're trying to figure out not just what happened, but why.
hmm We're looking at examples covering everything from, say, public memory and statues right through to very personal diaries and files.
It's not just about listing dates and facts.
No, not at all. It's about engaging with the past responsibly, ethically.
Mm.
So our kind of mission here is to unpack some of those core ethical considerations, trying to move beyond just like simple snap judgments towards a deeper, richer understanding.
Okay, let's start with that big one then. Judging the past. It's almost instinct, right? We see something like, I don't know, slavery, and immediately our modern selves just recoil. But the sources talk about this major tension. Presentism. What's the core problem there?
Well, the danger is letting our own, contemporary moral compass completely overshadow the actual context of the time. If we only judge historical actions by today's standards, we can totally miss the values, the constraints, the world people were actually living in back then.
Right.
The key idea, really, is that judging the past only by today's rules can actually blind us to yesterday's reality. You need to understand before you condemn, essentially.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost like watching an old movie and being shocked by attitudes that were, well, normal then, but are just unthinkable now.
Exactly.
And this tension really comes to a head with things like statues, doesn't it? All the debates around Confederate monuments, colonial figures.
Oh, absolutely. You saw it explode after 2020, really. The George Floyd protests, Rhodes Must Fall in places like Oxford, the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol.
Yeah.
It brings it all out.
Yep.
On one hand, you've got this powerful, necessary push to repudiate racism, oppression.
Yeah.
On the other, you hear people worrying about, erasing history.
And the source makes a really crucial point here. These monuments weren't just neutral decorations.
No. Often they were put up during very specific times, like, say, the Jim Crow era in the U.S. or at the peak of European empires. And their purpose then was often to actively legitimize inequality, to send a message about power.
So understanding when and why they were created is key.
Precisely. If you historicize the creation of the monument itself, it helps you evaluate its meaning today in a more informed way,
Right.
rather than just reacting based on how we feel right now.
It's definitely a balancing act. Because on the flip side, you have examples like the Canadian government officially apologizing for the residential school system. That's a very clear moral stance being taken now about the past.
And that's a really important distinction. You can have, and often should have, a present-day moral condemnation alongside deep historical research. We can and should condemn the devastating impact of those schools. But that doesn't stop us from also trying to understand the, frankly, flawed motivations and the worldview of past officials who genuinely, tragically, believe they were somehow civilizing indigenous children. It's about holding both things, understanding the why behind appalling actions.
So how do historians try to navigate this? Avoid just falling into crude presentism. The sources mention Lynn Hunt's two-step test as a kind of guideline.
Yeah, Hunt offers a pretty practical approach. 2 steps. First, she says, you absolutely have to explain the values and constraints of the period you're studying. Really dig into it. What did people believe? What were the limitations, the pressures they faced?
Okay, lay the groundwork.
Exactly. Then step 2, evaluate those actions against what she calls enduring moral benchmarks. These are principles like, the basic wrongness of torture or slavery, things that have been recognized as wrong across many different eras, even if they weren't always followed.
Why are those 2 steps so important together?
Well, the first step forces that contextual understanding. It stops you from just imposing today's views. But the second step provides a basis for making a moral evaluation that isn't just based on fleeting present-day opinions. It connects to deeper, long-standing human values.
Okay, that provides a useful framework. Let's shift gears a bit then to the power of language itself. The sources talk about how using really charged words like atrocity, hero, terrorist can profoundly shape how we see historical events or figures.
Oh, absolutely. These aren't neutral descriptors. They carry enormous baggage, emotional weight. They can almost shortcut our thinking,
Yeah, like telling you how to feel before you've even seen the evidence.
Precisely. Think about how loaded terms get thrown around in today's politics. It's exactly the same dynamic when we look back at history.
Let's take Cecil Rhodes. I definitely remember learning about him in a much more positive light, maybe, empire builder, philanthropist. But the whole Rhodes Must Fall campaign completely reframes him.
And that shift in perception is key. He was hailed as a hero by many in his own time and for a long while after. But now, rightly, activists and historians emphasize his role in, well, violent land seizures, his deeply racist ideology.
So the historian's job is?
It's to lay out the empirical record, show his political writings, detail the Matabele Wars, for instance, and then explain how and why perceptions of him have changed so dramatically over time. Even something like Wikipedia reflects this ongoing reevaluation.
What about even stronger labels, like atrocity or genocide? The sources use the example of the killings of Armenians in 1915. That term genocide is still incredibly contested.
It is, hugely so. While the vast majority of historical scholarship accepts it as genocide, the Turkish government vehemently rejects that label.
So how does a historian handle that ethically?
Well, they have a responsibility, really, to justify using such a powerful term. That means citing established definitions, like the UN's 1948 definition of genocide. And crucially, presenting the evidence survivor demographics, Ottoman documents from the time, diplomatic reports that supports that classification. You have to show your work.
And then there's that ultimate loaded pair, terrorist versus freedom fighter. The Nelson Mandela example is striking.
It really is. To think he was on the U.S. terror watch list until 2008.
Wow.
Yeah. That label was directly tied to the political context of apartheid South Africa. When apartheid fell, the legal and political designation changed.
So again, context is everything.
It is. And for historians, it's vital to show how these labels shift with context and also to point readers towards the primary sources. Let them read the ANC's own accounts of their sabotage campaigns or Mandela's speeches from the Rivonia trial. Let people grapple with the complexities beyond the simple label.
So it sounds like the rule of thumb is be really cautious with these powerful evaluative words.
That's basically it. Present the evidence first. Then, if you use an evaluative term, make sure you've justified it. And, importantly, acknowledge where reputable dissenting voices or alternative interpretations exist. Be upfront about the debates.
That leads nicely into the next point, which feels incredibly relevant today, the historian's duty to guard against the misuse or distortion of history.
Yes, this is a huge ethical responsibility. History can be weaponized, twisted for political agendas, used to promote hate. Historians have a role in trying to prevent that.
The case mentioned, Irving v. Penguin Books, the Holocaust-denial trial, seems like a really stark example.
It's a landmark case. The court finding that David Irving had, and I quote, deliberately misrepresented historical evidence. That's about as damning as it gets for a historian.
And the response from the other side.
Deborah Lipstadt's defense team did something ethically crucial. They published all their evidence, all the exhibits online. Total transparency. It meant anyone, anywhere could scrutinize the footnotes, check the sources, and see how Irving had distorted the record. It set a really high bar.
Then there are the ongoing controversies surrounding Japanese school textbooks.
Right, the debates about how events like the Nanjing massacre or the comfort women system are portrayed. These have been going on for decades, causing friction with neighboring countries like China and South Korea.
What's the ethical approach there for historians?
Well, often it involves meticulous comparative source criticism, putting Japanese accounts alongside records from Chinese, Korean, Allied archives, and crucially, survivor testimonies. This comparison helps to undercut attempts to whitewash or minimize atrocities.
It sounds like being proactive is important. The source mentions preventive tools.
Exactly. Things like creating open-access digital archives of primary sources, making high-resolution facsimiles of documents available, being really clear and explicit about your research methods in your publications.
Why does that help?
It just makes it harder for people with an agenda to cherry-pick quotes out of context or quietly ignore inconvenient evidence. Transparency and accessibility are, in a way, defenses against distortion.
Okay, let's turn to something maybe more personal, more sensitive. The privacy rights of the dead. It's not something you always think about when reading history.
No, but it's a really delicate area. So much historical research relies on private letters, diaries, medical files, but releasing that information, even long after someone's death, can have ethical implications.
The example of Anne Frank's diary is incredibly powerful here.
It is. Her father, Otto Frank, initially chose to publish an abridged version, leaving out some of the more, perhaps, adolescent or intimate passages. He was trying to protect her memory, her privacy in a way.
But later, the full diary was released.
Yes, and that sparked a real debate. How do you balance the immense historical importance, especially for Holocaust memory, with the posthumous privacy of a teenager writing in her diary? There's no easy answer.
And then you have cases like Franklin D. Roosevelt's medical files about his polio. Historians studying disability or leadership would find those invaluable, surely.
Absolutely invaluable. But again, you have the sensitivities of his family to consider. And the source notes that those files were only actually released after his descendants gave their consent. That respect for family wishes is a key factor.
What about state surveillance records? Like the Stasi archives in East Germany? They must be ethically complicated.
Extremely. On one hand, opening those files is crucial for understanding the scale and nature of state repression. It's vital for accountability, for memory. But opening them can also cause immense harm. It can re-traumatize victims whose lives were intruded upon, or expose informants who might have cooperated under duress, putting them or their families at risk today.
How do they manage that in Germany?
They have what's sometimes called a traffic light system for access. Some files might be fully open, green, some partially redacted, yellow, some remain closed, red, depending on whether living individuals could be harmed by disclosure. It's an attempt to balance historical truth with protecting people.
The source mentions some criteria, kind of adapted from data protection laws, for deciding on access. What are the main things to weigh up?
Yeah, it suggests considering how historically valuable and unique is the material. What's the likelihood of causing real harm to living relatives? How much time has passed since the records were created? And what were the likely expectations of privacy back then? It's a complex calculation.
Okay, finally, let's talk about dealing with new evidence. What happens when something emerges that potentially contradicts what we thought we knew? How should ethical historians react?
This is absolutely fundamental to the whole enterprise. A commitment to honest inquiry means you have to be open to new data, even, maybe especially, if it challenges your own previous work or long-cherished beliefs.
The discovery of Richard III's skeleton under that car park in Leicester back in 2012, that's an amazing example.
Isn't it just? And what was fascinating was how the detailed analysis, the 3D imaging of his spine, gave us a much more complex picture of his scoliosis.
How so?
Well, it challenged both the extreme Tudor propaganda that painted him as this monstrous hunchback and some later revisionist attempts that tried to dismiss any physical abnormality altogether. The truth was more nuanced.
And this new evidence actually changed things.
Yes. Textbooks got updated, museum displays were revised. It's a perfect case study of historical understanding evolving based on new physical evidence, scholarship adapting.
There's another example mentioned, the Norse site at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland.
Right. That site was found way back in 1960, but it was much more recent dating techniques, specifically radiocarbon wiggle matching around 2021, that really nailed down the timing.
What did they find?
They could pinpoint Viking presence there to the year 1021 CE. That kind of precision forces adjustments to the old, very Columbus-centric narratives about Europeans in the Americas.
And that's filtering down.
Yeah, the source notes that this new dating is now being incorporated into the information at the national park site itself, and even in school curricula. It shows how historical knowledge isn't static.
It really highlights how our understanding of the past is always potentially a work in progress.
It absolutely is. And a really good ethical practice for historians, mentioned in the source, is to consciously maintain what's sometimes called a counter-archive.
What's that?
It's basically keeping track of dissenting sources, alternative interpretations, evidence that doesn't quite fit your main argument. And then, crucially, explaining your footnotes or methods section why you've chosen to privilege certain evidence or interpretations over others. It's about transparency.
So wrapping this all up, it really feels like ethical historical practice is this constant, careful balancing act.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. It's always trying to contextualize first before you judge, to earn those moral labels with solid evidence, to fight distortion actively through transparency and open access.
And weighing public interest against, the dignity of people long dead.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, always being willing to welcome new, maybe unsettling data that forces us to rethink things.
And looking at all these examples we've discussed, the monument debates, the libel trials, the textbook fights, these privacy dilemmas, the archaeological surprise is keeping these ethical principles in mind is how historians can really do justice to the complexity of the past.
And also fulfill their responsibility to us here in the present.
Yeah.
Which perhaps leads to a final thought for you, the listener. How might these ethical challenges we've talked about, The need for context, the danger of labels, the importance of evidence. How might they relate to how you interpret current events? How you engage with the flood of information you encounter every single day?
What responsibility do we all have, maybe, in seeking out context and trying to avoid those easy, simplistic judgments in our own lives? Something to think about.